Hello everyone and welcome. In this lecture, we'll have it so that we can now mouse over our tanks and bases, buildings, whatever, and we can see the health bars. So if I move this tank around and then I come over here and I start shooting, we see the health bar gets depleted. Still nothing happens when they die apart from a log in the chat, but the health bar does go down and we can, add health bars to whatever we like as long as it has a health component to go along with it. So we can see how our base is doing, how our different units are doing. And in your game, you could implement it differently. I just have it so that the health bars turn on and off as your mouse enters. You might just want them on at all times or whatever you like. So let's get started with this lecture. So of course, to make the health bar, we're going to need to write some code. Let's head over to our scripts, combat, and with the health script, we'll make a health display script, and we'll open that up in Visual Studio Code. So inside here, this won't be a networked object. We don't need to send any data over the network. We don't need to do any commands to tell the server to do something. So it can just be a mono behavior. And what we want to do is we want to get reference to a health component so we can, of course, display the health. So serialize field private health, and we'll call it health, like so. And we also need, of course, reference to some UI. And the way I'm going to do it is I'm going to have these health bars disabled, and when you mouse over a unit or a building, their health bar pops up. So, serialize field private game object, and this will be the health bar parent. So this is going to be what we toggle on and off. And finally, the actual thing that we need to change to display the health, we'll actually be using an image for this. So private image, and we need to import here, one sec, image. Let's give it a name, health bar image. We need to go back to the image, hit control period, and add using Unity engine.UI. So when do we want to update the UI? We want to update it whenever the health changes. And right now, we don't have an easy way of knowing that. So if we go over to the health script, we raise an event when we die, but we should also raise an event whenever the health changes so that this health display script can say, whenever the health changes, update the UI. So let's make another event over in the health script. And this event is just for clients. So what we'll do is we'll make a public event action, but we need to pass through something. We need to pass through the current health and the max health. And with those two bits of data, the UI can then display the bar as either half full, fully full, 75% full, or whatever. So we want to pass through an int for the current health and an int for the max health. And we want to give it a name. So the name will be client. I usually like to name the events server or client based on where they're getting raised. And we'll call it client on health updated. Now, where should this code be raised? We currently only have some server-side logic here. We don't yet have any client logic. But if you remember, we have this sync var for the current health. And what we can do is we can actually put in a function here that gets raised whenever the health changes. So let's make that function in the client. We'll call it private void handle health updated. And with these, they have to take in two parameters of the same type that you're syncing. So we're syncing an integer for the current health. So int old health, int new health. Then if we go back up to here, in the sync var, we can say hook equals name of, or you could just type the function name as a string, but that's usually, if you type it wrong, then it'll break. And if you change the name later, you'll break it without realizing. So I like to use name of and then handle health updated. So now the server will change the current health. It'll then sync this to the client. And whenever a client, so me, whenever I receive the new health value of 75, it will then call this method down here with new health being 75. And then what do we want to do? We just want to raise an event and then the UI can update. So let's raise the event client on health updated !.invoke, just like we do for the server on die. But we want to pass through two parameters, arg1 and arg2, which is current health and max health. So the current health is this new health value. And the max health doesn't actually change, which it's just set up here as the max health. So let's pass through max health. And what that allows us to do now is health being synced in here, then this script will say, hey, the health updated. So this health display script can now actually update the UI. This is better than a common way that beginners do it, which would be to have this health script have reference to the health display script and say, whenever the health changes, health display.update, because now it's the health display listening in for this. So we could just remove the health display script and we would not have to modify this at all. And it also means we can add in new scripts that care about the health changing if you wanted that. So maybe you want some sound effects to play when the health changes. You could add another script, listen for this event, and do whatever you want to do. So in here, we just need to make sure we subscribe and unsubscribe from the event. Just like we do for the the RTS player, we subscribe and unsubscribe. So we want to do the same over here. And we can do it in on enable and on disable, but I prefer for this kind of thing to do it in awake and destroy. So private void awake, private void on destroy. And these get called by Unity when this object starts existing and when it gets destroyed. And what we want to do is want to make a method to actually update the UI. So let's say private void handle health updated. And that'll take in the current health, and the max health. And all we want to do whenever these new values come in is update this health bar image. So health bar image dot fill amount, and this goes between 0 and 1. So we have to do the current health divided by the max health, and that will give you the value between 0 and 1 that you want to use. So we can say current health over max health. But because these are both integers, that will give us back an integer. So it will only give us 0 or 1. It will never give us a decimal. So to make it give us a decimal, we just have to convert one of these to a float just by putting this beforehand, and it'll work just fine. And now we can say to the health script to use this method whenever the health updates. So we can say health dot client on health updated, and we can add the handle health updated method. And then over here we can say health dot client on health updated minus equals handle health updated. And finally for this, whenever our mouse enters and exits this game object, we want to turn it on and off. So unless you want your game to have the health bars on all the time, it's up to you. But I'm going to do it so they come on when you mouse over something. So private void on mouse enter, and that's another method that Unity calls on mono behaviors whenever your mouse enters. So we can say health bar parent dot set active true, and then of course there's an on mouse exit health bar parent dot set active false. So now when the script starts existing, we listen for when the health changes, and then when it does, we update the health bar fill, and we also of course unsubscribe when we get rid of this object. And then when our mouse enters, we turn on the UI. When our mouse exits, we turn off the UI. Let's go into Unity, and we want to do this health bars on all our buildings and units and whatever. So what we should do is we should make a prefab for this, then we can use it for both. So let's make an empty game object, and we'll just call this the health bar canvas. We then want to add the canvas component to this, and this is usually huge, so let's make this a bit smaller. Let's say a width of 1 and a height of 0.2. And what we can do, we can of course then modify that for each individual thing we put the health on. Let's just set all these anchors to 0, and I think that's fine. Then we should go and make a child, so UI image, like so. And this image is currently 100 by 100. We want it to just scale with the canvas, so we can press this anchor, hold down the Alt key, so Alt will do this, and then we can click on the bottom right, and that will scale it. So you see these little anchor points on the corners. Obviously this isn't a UI course, and I'm not an expert on UI, but I know how to do this kind of stuff. So what that means is now if we take the canvas and make it smaller, it also makes the image smaller. And we can turn off this raycast target and maskable. We don't need to use any of that stuff for this. And this can be the background, so you can say like, whoops, I clicked something. So we can say, here we go, health bar underscore background, and we can duplicate it and call it health bar underscore health. And because, like I said, we want to change the fill amount of an image, and you don't actually see that right now. The image, there's no fill amount. So if we go to sprites, we already have a circle sprite, but a square sprite would make more sense for this. So let's create, and I still don't know why this isn't added by default, but we can add a square sprite and call it square. and then we can simply drag that in here. So now, if we made this a different color, let's just make it some wacky color for now. Well, red's pretty appropriate. If we then go to image type and set it to filled, it's currently radial. So as this value fill amount changes, it's a radial thing, and we don't want that. We want to go for horizontal, like this. So as the health goes down, this goes down. And now it's time for your challenge, which is to create the health bar UI. And I've already done most of this stuff with you now. It's just a case of tweaking it and making it look how you want it to look. So make sure the canvas is on world space, which it is. Create a background image, which we've done. And that's just so that when the health bar goes down, there's still a background there so you can see relatively, what percentage it's on. Because if it's just a health bar only, you don't have a clue if they're on 50 or 100% health or whatever. Then create the image with the image type set to filled. We've already done that. And that's it for your challenge. So have a go, pause the video, and make your health bar look how you want it to look. Welcome back. I hope you paused the video. Now let's have a go at doing it how I did it. You don't have to follow this bit exactly, but if you're unsure of what to do, then just feel free to follow along. So I'll just put it to more of a brighter red like this. And what we want is we want the background to be maybe black with a bit of transparency on it. So I'll put it to around here. Whoops, clicked off it. So that's all we want to do on the background. And then on the actual health itself, we want to add some padding of let's say 0.02, 0.02, 0.02, 0.02. So now as our health bar goes down, you can actually see, how much health they're on. We can see they're on about, like 2/3 health. So let's put it back to 1. And now that you've done with the health bar, you want to disable it because it should be off by default. So let's turn that off. And we also want to reuse this for all our different things. So let's make it a prefab by going to assets, prefabs, and dragging the health bar canvas in. Then we can get rid of it from our scene. If we go to the unit prefab, we then want to add on the health bar canvas as a child. Let's turn it on so we can see how it looks. It's currently inside the tank, so let's move it up to about here. Give it a width of, let's say, 2. 2 should do, maybe 3. We'll go with 2. And the height, maybe 0.3. 2.75, that looks good for now. We will write some code to make the health bar rotate to face the player or the camera, so wherever you're looking from, it should obviously face you. For now, we'll just leave it like this. And we want to turn this off because it should be off by default. And then add a script to the unit, which is the health display script. And this wants reference to 1, the health component, which is on here, so drag that in. The health bar image, so let's open this up. This is the health bar image. And the health bar parent is this. Then we can quickly go over to the unit spawner, go to the health bar canvas, drag that in, turn it on, and let's drag it up a bit. Maybe that health bar size is right for this, or maybe you want it to be a bit bigger, 1.5 and 1.5 high. And then same thing, turn it off, go back to the spawner, add on the health display, and then drag the things in. So health, drag in the parent, and drag in the image. So now we should be able to go ahead and build, but we need to do one last little thing, and this might be a bit frustrating, and it was frustrating for me too, but as much as I want to just, have my project on the new input system, there are still a few things that aren't yet supported, and one of those things is this, the on-mouse enter and on-mouse exit. Of course, we could write our own thing to use this, so we could use the new input system, write our own code to when the mouse enter and exits, but that would require a lot more effort and time. If we want to just use the already built-in on-mouse enter and exit, this uses the old input system. So we have to go to our project settings, project settings, other, and then go down and set it to both. We can still use the new input system, but this is something which needs the old. So just set it to both. It might get you to restart your project, and then once you're done, you can build and run. And for the rest of this course, we'll just leave it on both, because I guess if you leave it on both, you're not going to really run into any problems. So we'll leave it on both. It's a lot safer. Now the build is done. I've spawned in a tank, or 2 tanks, and we can now mouse over them and see their health bar. It would look better when we add the code to rotate to face the camera, but just for now, we can actually see the health bar shows and hides when we mouse over it. And if I click on this tank and start shooting, we then see the health bar going down. Of course, when they die, all it does is logs, and I can't attack my own base, but I can see its health. And if I click the other base, I can start shooting and see its health. When we actually make the game properly and we, make more buildings and units, we'll make the bases a bit bigger. Now they're pretty small, but you can see it works. The health bar updates for everything. So yeah, that's it for this lecture. We've now got health bars working. We can still do some slight improvements, but now that we've got all this, we can move on to assigning team colors and actually having it so that when units and buildings die, things do happen apart from just a log in the console. So I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye. Hello everyone and welcome. In this lecture, we'll be making it so when we damage our enemy tanks or buildings and they actually reach 0 health, they'll now get destroyed. I can now move around and go kill the base over here. When the base dies, it does get destroyed, and we want to do more than just that, because in the upcoming lecture or lectures, we'll be working on the game loop where the base dies, it checks how many people are left, there's just one, so this is the winner, and then we can have some UI pop up and say player 1 winner or whatever you want, and then we can have a button to go back to the menu and stop the server or disconnect the client. So that's what we'll be doing in this lecture. Let's get started. So currently, when a unit or a building dies, nothing actually happens apart from a log in the console. And we want different logic for everything that dies. Some things might have shared logic, so all the different units might, for example, just get destroyed and maybe give money or XP or whatever to whoever killed them. But in our case, the buildings, for example, do different things, or more specifically, the base, when that dies, if there's only 2 players, the game ends. If there's 3, then it's always when there's 1 left, then the game ends. So what we need to do is we need to go to our scripts, combat health, and we made an event last time that's raised on the server. Remember, it's where it's raised, so on the server, then on die is just the name of the event, and we raise it here on the server when we die. Currently we log just so we could see it working, but we actually want to have custom logic for whenever this is raised, and that logic isn't going to be in the script, because this script should work for everything. Then each individual thing, like units, buildings, the base, they will all have their own scripts for this. If we look at our buildings folder, we have the unit spawner, and currently our base is a unit spawner, though we'll end up changing that so that the base is separate to that. The base shouldn't produce units, a separate building should produce units, but for now they're the same thing. So what we should do is, we should say, what happens when a unit spawner dies? What happens when it dies? Well, in this case, it just gets destroyed. So what we want to do is want to have some logic in here to subscribe to that death event, and then when we die, get destroyed. So in our case, we want to add reference, so serialize field private, and it's the health component, so we'll just call this health. And then on the server, we want to subscribe and unsubscribe. We'll be doing a lot of event work, so if you don't get it right now or you haven't got it already, we'll be doing it again and again, so hopefully it will end up making sense. Just like how we do over in the player script, we subscribe and unsubscribe. We want to do the same thing over here, so we'll say override on start server and override on stop server. And we want to say here, health dot, and then we have the event, not the client one, but the server on die event. And we want to subscribe, and we want something to happen when that dies. So we want to say handle server on die. I'm actually going to name it server handle die, like that. That'll be the naming I'll go with. And then over here we want to unsubscribe, so let's just copy paste this, but make sure to change it to be a minus. And now that means when this object is alive, this function, that doesn't exist yet, that function will be called whenever we die on the server. So let's make a method for that here. So we'll say server, private void, and we'll call it server handle die. That takes in nothing. And this is where we can put our logic for what happens when we die. And all we want to do for this building right now, we will be changing it. But for now, we just want to destroy it. So network server.destroy. So this is how we get rid of objects that are networked objects, such as the buildings. And we have to pass in the object, which is this object. So game object. So now if we go back into Unity and give it a second, we can head over to our prefabs where this is. So in assets, prefabs, and we did it for the unit spawner. So we see here, we've got unit spawner, needs reference to a health component, so let's drag that in. And now on start server, it's going to subscribe to that event over here. So whenever this raises that event, our spawner will destroy itself. So whenever the spawner is told that this thing has died, it will destroy itself. That allows us to then, in the case of the units, maybe do the same thing. In the unit script, just say when we die, destroy ourselves. And then, like I said, in the base, we want to say when we die, see if the game should end, and then maybe also destroy ourselves. We can do whatever we like. Just to prove that this works, I'm going to go build and give it a test. Now that it's built, let's have a go. So I'll move this tank out of the way, and I'll say over here, come over and kill this base. And as the health goes down, 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 it now gets destroyed. But obviously when the tank, if I hit the tank, yeah, the rotation speed is messed up. We will spend a lecture, yeah, as you can see here, it doesn't actually kill it. We will spend a lecture all about, you know, making the map and the tanks the right size and speed that kind of feels good. Right now, I've kind of skipped over that because it's not too important. That's all about tweaking at the end. For now, we've been focused on getting all the systems working. But yeah, you see, the bases die, but the tanks don't. And that's why it's now time for your challenge. To create the logic for the unit. And it's going to be the exact same thing we just did, but for the unit. I think you have the knowledge you need now to be able to do that. So go into the unit script, and you'll need to add reference to the health script, just like we did. Use the onStart and onStop server to subscribe and unsubscribe from the server onDie method event, respectively. Just like we did, you can always look back to the unit spawner script, and it's pretty much the exact same code, because those two things, we want them to do the same thing, which is just get destroyed when they die. If we need anything specific for either one of them later, we can just add it in. But for now, just getting rid of them is good enough. And then, like I said, make a method that's called from that event, and all it'll do is network server.destroy the game object. Have a go, pause the video, and I'll be back in a minute. Welcome back. I hope you paused the video and gave that a go. Let's stop running the game like I was already running it. And we now just want to go over to our units, and all our units want to do that same behavior. So instead of just copy pasting it, I think I'll type it out again. It'll be better for those of you following along. So private health, and then we want to go down here, and we already have an onStart and onStop server event here. So we want to just add, callback. We want to just add into here health.server onDie plus equals server handled die. I could have named die and death a bit better, but I'm sticking with it now. It doesn't really matter as long as we know what it means. So server on die minus equals server handle die. And now we just need this method, so we'll keep it inside this server region. So we'll go down here. We'll make a server method, private void server handle die. And all it's going to do is network server.destroy the game object. This attribute isn't compulsory. You don't technically have to have it, but it just stops us accidentally calling it in places where we shouldn't. And we should probably go check the spawner. Yeah, we have already put it there, so that's all good. And then remember to go back into the editor before we test again. Go back to our prefabs for our unit. Go to the unit script, and it now needs reference to a health component. So let's go find that down here, health. And let's go drag that in. Where is the unit script? It's up, and it's there. But before we actually build and get any errors, we're almost there. But we'll have this problem now where we select a unit and then it dies. And when it dies, we're then kind of stuck, because in our selection handler, if we go back to our scripts, selection handler, so units, unit selection handler, we say over here, we add units to a list and we select them. And then at the start over here, when we make a new selection, we deselect all the ones we currently have and we clear the list. But if a unit dies, it's actually still in that list, meaning that now there's a null entry in the list and we get errors. So what we want to do is, whenever a unit that belongs to us is despawned, aka it dies, then we want to remove it from the list. And it's quite handy for us that we already have an event in the unit script called authority on unit spawned, and in this case despawned. So we can tell as a client whenever one of our own units is despawned. And if we look down here, we raise it whenever it stops existing. So that works for when it dies or when the server stops or anything. So all we need to do is subscribe to it in here in the selection handler. So we need to go in here, and we should say, after getting the camera, the unit dot, and then we have the authority on unit despawn. So whenever one of our units is despawned, we want to say handle or authority, handle unit despawned. And we have to make sure to unsubscribe when this script stops existing. So private void on destroy is called by Unity. And we want to do the same and unsubscribe. And now we need to actually make this event. So I feel like we'll go put it at the bottom. Let's go all the way down. And what level am I on? It's this level. So private void authority handle unit despawned. And this actually gives us a unit. You see these two little red bits up here. It's because we haven't passed in a unit. So all we want to do here is say, well, if the unit is in our selected units, then get rid of it from selected units. So whenever a unit dies, it doesn't have problems with still being in the list. So we can just say selected units dot remove this unit. It's that simple. There won't be any errors here if it's not in the list, because how this method works is it just tries to do it. And if it managed to do it, it says true, it returns true. And if it failed, it returns false. And in our case, we don't really care if it's in the list or not anyway. We just want to say if it is, then get rid of it. And that's what this does for us.
And then finally, we need to make a few changes to where we actually raise these events for units being spawned and despawned. Because this is true that it is raised on the client that has authority, but it isn't actually raised for the server, which is a problem because if you're hosting, you are the server and the client. So we need to jump over to where we do that. And that's over in the unit script. So let's go over here. And this is where we raise the event on spawned and despawned. So here we check if we have authority, which is good because this is for whoever has authority. But we also do a client only check, which is for checking if you're running a server or not. And that's not really right for what we want. So let's get rid of this. And we're left with checking if we have authority. But then what we can actually do to make this even easier is we can just use a different callback here on start authority. And then we can just get rid of this line entirely. So this is now invoked on behaviors that have authority. But for despawning, it's a little bit more complicated than this. We can't just use the onStop authority callback, which does exist, but this only gets called when authority is removed. You can directly remove authority from an object on the server. So that's what that does. We can't use that as a start and stop here. We still have to use onStop client and just do an authority check here. But we don't need to do this check anymore because like we said, otherwise this will stop it running on the host client. So now that's done, over in the unit selection handler, this will be called regardless of if you're hosting the server or if you're just another client. But by changing this, we have to do one other change, otherwise we've broken something else. So if we head over to the RTS player, where we use this event as well, this is where we subscribe and unsubscribe. So right now we're subscribing to this event, the authority on unit spawned, but we're doing it in the onStart client method, which, you know, it actually does work right now, but it still is a bit weird because, you know, even for units we don't have authority over, we're still subscribing. So let's change this as well to onStart authority. And the client only check isn't actually going to work because this bool isn't set to the correct value this early on. This is immediately when the object starts existing. So this bool isn't actually correct. We have to check it a different way. So all we're really wanting to do here is say, if we're the server, return. So the other way to check that will work here, is saying if network server dot active. That tells us if this, this machine is running as a server. So if that's true, then return. And like I said, we don't have an authority check here, even though this is for things that have authority. So we should say here, if we're the server or not has authority, then return. And just to remove some code down here that we don't need anymore then, we were doing the authority checks down here. So we were subscribing all the time, but then just returning early if we don't have authority. But now the way I've changed it is we just don't even subscribe if we don't have authority, which I think makes a lot more sense. And then that means we can just get rid of these lines here, and then we're good to go. Let's see if it works now. So we'll make a unit for both of us. And this is selected here, so I'm going to try killing it now. And hopefully when I kill it, so we'll see here, it's going to die. Now that it's dead, I should be able to spawn in a new unit and use it just fine without any errors. Cool. Keep in mind that error down there is actually just from the
It's the thing I said that we'll sort out when we make a lobby. But making a lobby will come near the end of the course because we want to actually get our game working. The lobby can come later. So yeah, that's it for this lecture. We now have killing of the enemy base. This is our base, so obviously we can't kill that. Let's send them over here. We can now kill the enemy base. Obviously, it gets destroyed, but the game doesn't end. So the next thing to do is actually ending the game and sending us back to the main menu, like having a little pop-up saying player 1 wins or player 2 wins, return to menu, something like that. That's what we'll be doing in the next lecture, so I'll see you there. Goodbye. Hello everyone, and welcome. In this lecture, we'll be making it so that when we destroy the enemy's base, we actually get a log in the console saying that the game is over, and then if we had 3 players, it would only log that when we kill 2 players and then there's 1 remaining. So only when a base is destroyed and there is then 1 remaining, it will log game over. And in the next lecture, we'll replace the game over with an actual game over screen and a button to exit the game. And we'll also stop our units from being able to move around. Once you're dead, you're basically a spectator. So let's get started. So in RTSs, to win the game, you have to be the last player standing with your base. If your base is destroyed, in some games, the rest of your units can still move around and you can, make new bases. But for the sake of this, if your base is destroyed, you lose all your buildings, all your units. So you have to really defend your base. And when there's 1 player left, the game's over. It tells everyone this player's the winner and you get a way to exit the game. And as I said, this happens when the base dies, but currently the only custom logic we have for buildings is when the spawner dies. So let's make another script, and this is going to be for the base. So we'll just call it the unit base, and we'll open that up in Visual Studio Code. So the base will be a networked object, so let's change this from mono to network behavior, import mirror, and there will also be server and client code in here. So let's make some regions for the server, end region, and then a region for the client code and region. And now it's actually time for your challenge already, which is to handle the death event. So we're going to add the health script to this object, and then we want reference to it. So to add reference to the health script, this is the same challenge we actually did previously. I think it's good to get into the pattern of the subscribing and unsubscribing of events, because it's something we've already done quite a bit of and we will be doing more of. So if you can get into the flow of using events, it'd be really good. So use the onStart and onStop server to subscribe and unsubscribe. And then make a method that's called from the event, which will network server.destroy the game object. And this is the exact same that you did in the previous lecture. So if you forget how to do this, just go and have a look at the unit spawner script and it'll be pretty much the exact same. So pause the video and give this a go. Okay, I hope you paused the video and gave that a go. Let's head back. And the way we do this is I'm going to type it all out rather than copy pasting. So we're going to add reference to the health. So let's add reference. And then in the server here, we want to subscribe. So let's override on start server, and also on stop server. So then in the start, we'd like to say health.server_onDie. So we have that event. We want to subscribe and we want to make a method called, let's say, server handle die. Then over in the stop, we want to unsubscribe. And then we need to make this method itself. So let's say down here, we want a server method called server handle die. And what does it do? Well, like we said, for now, we just want it to destroy the base. So network server.destroy this game object. And right now, this is the exact same that we do in the unit spawner. And for now, our base and the unit spawner are going to be the same thing, though we will spread it out. So eventually, we'll have the base just be its own independent object, and the spawner is something you purchase and place. For now, they're both on the same object. And that means that when they die, they'll both try destroying themselves. So just so we don't get any problems there, head over to the unit spawner, and we'll just comment out the line where it's destroyed, so that it only happens once over in the base. Just like how both the base and the spawner care when the health component says we died, there is another thing we need, some manager to handle when the game's over, and that cares about when the base dies, specifically the base, not anything else. So we need to actually make events in the base to say when the base is spawned and when the base is despawned, just like how we do that with units. So let's make 2 new events. We're going to have a public static event, and it'll pass through a unit base, because when we raise this event, we want to say which base it is that was spawned and which base it was that was despawned. So let's add system because it needs it for the namespace, and we'll call this server on base spawned, and then we'll copy paste this line, and we'll go with server on base despawned. And if you don't recognize this, let's just jump over to the unit. Notice in unit we have the same thing over here for when a unit is spawned and despawned. What this allows us to do now is to, every time a base is spawned, we add it to a list, and that will store all the remaining players. And then whenever one of them despawns, so they either leave the server or they die, then that is raised. And then the other script that has that list of bases will then remove that base from the list, and we can check how many's left. And if there's one left, then the game's over, that player wins. Let's just be sure to actually raise these events. So we'll go down here and we'll say server on base spawned, !invoke this, because it's this class that we're passing through, this instance of this class. And then when we stop the server, we raise it here. So server on base despawned, .invoke, and it doesn't really matter whether we, put this line before or after this other line. It doesn't make a difference, but I like to do it this way. So now all we've got is a script that destroys itself when it dies and raises events to say when it was spawned and despawned. So now we need something else to, like I said, listen in for this to determine when the game's over or not. And this will be kind of a two-part lecture because it'll be too much to do in a single lecture. But let's make that other script, and we're going to call it something like the game over handler. And I'll do it in the script with the buildings because it is pretty much directly tied to the unit base. So we'll call this the game over handler. And once that's done, we'll open it up. So this is a networked behavior. And like I said, the one job of this script is just to track the bases when they spawn and despawn, and then, determine whether the game should be over or not. And this will have some client and some server code. So let's quickly add a server region and a client region. The client stuff will come later, but on the server, we want to subscribe to those two events we just made over here for when the base is spawned and despawned. So let's override start server, override stop server, and we have the two methods like usual. And this time, instead of subscribing and coming up with a name and then making the method, we'll do it the other way around. So we'll first of all make the method. So private void, we'll call it server handle base spawned. And remember, this takes in a unit base. We'll call it the unit base. Because back over in here, we pass a unit base in through the event. So we have one for spawned and one for despawned, like this. And these are server only methods, so let's add on the server tag. Only the server's running that. And then up here we can actually subscribe now. So we can say unit base dot on server on base spawned plus equals server handle base spawned. When a base is spawned, run this method. And then we can say when a base is despawned, run this method here. And just like usual, on stop, we want to do the same, but unsubscribing. Now we've got through the boring stuff. What do we actually want to do? Well, we want to, whenever a base is spawned, add it to a list and store it. So let's make that list. We want to have, a private list. So private list of type unit base. So we can have a list of bases, and we'll call it bases. Initialize the list. So we have this empty list, and whenever a base is spawned, we'd like to add to the list. So bases.add this unit base. That's quite simple. And then whenever a base is despawned or destroyed, someone leaves, dies, whatever, we want to remove it from the list. Bases.remove. But then after removing it, we want to check how many are left. So we'll say, well, if bases.count is not 1, then return. We don't care if there's still a player left. But if there is only one player left, then it means the game is over. So we can say here, debug.log game over. Because we will be adding more to it. Like I said, we don't want this one lecture to go on too long. But now we can actually determine here on the server whenever the game is over. And now we just need some way to get this object into the scene, and we can't just go and drop it in the scene because it's a networked object. It needs to be spawned in over the network. But we can't really associate the game over handler with any particular player. It's just a server only thing. So the server needs to spawn it in, and I think a good place to do that is over in the network manager. So in the network manager, we want to spawn in the game over handler whenever we change to a scene that is a map. If we change to the main menu or some game over screen or something, then we don't want to spawn in one of those handlers, only if it's a map. So let's first of all get reference to it. So serialize field private, game over handler, game over handler. Whoops. And now we can go down here and we want to have somewhere to spawn it in. So let's look at the server callbacks. So override on server. And we have this one for changing scene, but this is called before the scene is changed, like just before it's about to change scene. And then this one down here, scene changed, is called just afterward. And the override doesn't have any default logic in here, it's empty, so we don't need to call the base. And we want to write our own logic to spawn in the game over handler. And we only want to actually spawn in this if it's a map that we're going to. We don't want to do it if we're going back to the main menu or anything like that. So what we can do here is we can check this scene name to see, is it a map? You know, does it begin with scene_map? But the problem is this scene name isn't just going to be scene_map_1. It's going to be assets/scenes/ it's the whole path to wherever your scene is. So what we can do instead is not actually use this, and we can say if scene manager, which is a Unity thing, so let's change it to be scene manager and using Unity engine.scene management. And we can get the name normally, so we can say .getActiveScene .name, and we can see if the name starts with scene_map. And if it does, then we can write the logic to spawn in the game over handler. We want to instantiate it and then network server spawn it, just like we do with projectiles. So we'll say the game over handler, and we'll call it the game over handler instance. This should be a capital G. Okay, game over handler instance equals instantiate, want to spawn in this game over handler prefab. Let's rename this to be prefab. And that spawns it in just on the server. Now we want to network server spawn it. So network server.spawn the game over handler instance. But this is a game over handler and we want it as an object, so we can get the .game object. And now I'll give an overview of what we've done in this lecture. So we have said that whenever the server changes scene, and this is on the server side, the server will check, is this new scene a map? If so, spawn in the game over handler and, network server spawn it so everyone will get this. Then in a base, whenever a base is spawned and despawned, we raise this event and, we die when we die. And this event for when we spawn and despawn a base is being listened to by the game over handler, which says, whenever a base is spawned, add it to my list. Whenever a base is despawned, remove it from my list. And also check how many's left, and if there is exactly one left, then the game is over. And then, in the upcoming lecture, we can take that and then announce on the screen, this player is the winner. Click here to exit the game. Now, if we go back over into Unity, we should be able to test this. So we need to actually make the game over handler. So let's make an empty game object, reset, and we'll stick on the game over handler. And we'll name the object the game over handler. And we need to make this into a prefab to spawn in. So let's go to prefabs, drag it in, delete it from the scene. And now our network manager, if we scroll down, wants reference here to a game over handler. So let's drag that in and apply changes. And then the unit spawner is now really our unit base. So let's rename it unit base and stick on the unit base component and drag in the health because it needs reference to that. And now that that's done, we can go and build in Unity. Now that it's built, let's head over to the console and we'll clear it so that it's clean. We'll take this tank and we'll try and kill this base. And when it dies, we should get a log saying the game is over, because this game over handler in our scene will log that to the console. And then we're done. That's basically it. We could check the other way around too. So if we just stop and we start over here, we technically shouldn't get a log. I also don't know why the base spawned down here, but we shouldn't get a log because we are now running as a client in the editor, so we won't actually get that log there. But that's to be expected. But what we actually want now in the next lecture is to, as I said, have a game over thing here, and then we want to be able to go back to the menu. We will then also need to add some stuff to say, when you die, if there's still 2 other players going, or 3 other players, however many, then you aren't allowed to, let's say, spawn buildings, spawn units, do anything. You're basically just a spectator once you're dead. So we'll have to think about that too. But for now, we're done with this lecture, so let's get into the next one. I'll see you there. Hello everyone, and welcome. In this lecture, we'll be making it so that when we kill the enemy base, the game will actually end. It'll display to all the clients in the game who the winner is. So for now, this will say that player 1 is the winner, and that they've won now. I can't now click on the base and spawn in any more units or anything. And if I now click leave game on here as a client, I will leave. And then the server, the host can leave too. The game's over and we're done. That's what we'll be doing in this lecture. Let's get started. So when the game's over, we want some UI to pop up, and UI is all client side, so we need to have some event that's triggered on the client side when the game is over. So let's head over to our script, and we'll want to go into our buildings, game over handler. So let's make that event that's raised on the client side. So the naming convention I usually do for events starts with server or client based on where it's being raised. So let's make a public static event action. Now let's add system. And what data do we want to pass through? Well, all we're doing is we're going to show on the UI the name of the person who won. And right now we don't have a way to set names, so we'll just say like player ID, player 1, player 2. So we want to pass through a string, which is going to be the player's name. So we'll say client on game over. And it's the server that figures out when the game is over. Down here, this is when the game's over. So the server needs to actually tell the client that the game's over. And the way the server calls code on the client is by using an RPC. So let's make a client RPC, and we have to start it with RPC, and we'll call it RPC game over. And that takes in a string, which is the winner's name. And all we do here on the client side is then raise that client side event. So client on game over dot invoke the winner. And that will allow us to now make a script for our UI and subscribe to this event, and then when this event's triggered, we pop it up saying the game's over. So instead of debug logging now, we're going to say RPC game over, and the actual name that we're going to pass through would be the player's name, but for now we just want to say their ID. So what we can do here is we can figure out what their ID is by saying the RTS player winner, because that's the player script. The winner is bases 0, because we've got the list of bases, and if there's 1 left, then we can access bases 0, which is that person, connection to client, because this is on the server side, and then we can get their connection ID, for example. So this is just a unique identifier for that player. And rather than actually storing it as a player for now, we'll store it as an int. So int player ID. And we want it as a string, so let's say player and then player ID. If you forgot what this string means, it just means if you put a $sign before it, then you can insert variables inside curly braces. So it's player space and then the variable player ID. So when someone wins, the server tells all the clients the winner is player 1, player 2, or whatever. And then the clients say, okay, I'm going to let anything on my side that cares about that know. And the only thing that cares about it right now will be the UI that pops up. So let's go make the UI now. We'll head back into Unity, give it a second. And we don't need to do anything else on this game object for the game over handler because all we've changed is just raising an event. But we do, however, want to make a new folder for menus, I think makes sense. And we'll call this the game over display. We'll open that up. Now the game over display is completely client side, so it doesn't actually need to be a network behavior. Anything that's running this is just going to be client side. And all we want to do is we want to subscribe to the event for when the game is over on a client. We want to subscribe to this. So we can do that in start and on destroy. Private void on destroy. And we'll make private void start, get rid of the comment, and we're good to go. So we'll want to say here game over handler dot, and we can listen to the client on game over event, plus equals client handle game over. And then down here we'll unsubscribe. It's probably becoming very easy to understand what's going on now because we've done so much subscribing and unsubscribing of events. And then down here we'll actually make the method. So private void client handle game over. And this takes in a string, remember, which is the winner. So we need some UI here to actually set that name. So let's add a reference to some UI. Serialize field, private, and we want reference to, we're using text mesh pro, so it's tmp underscore text is the text element, the winner name text. That requires us to import tm pro, like so. So now in here, whenever the game is over and we're told the winner's name, we'll put it on our UI. So we'll say the winner name text dot text equals, and then we'll say here, winner has won, exclamation mark. And I'll actually capitalize this. So now it'll say player 2 has won, but this UI is going to be disabled until someone actually wins, then we need to enable it. So to enable it, we're going to need something to set active. So let's make a reference to a game object, and we'll call it the game over display object, or parent. We'll call it the game over display parent. Then down here, we can enable it. So the game over display parent dot set active true. So we're now enabling the parent. And the one other thing we need here is the way to actually shut down the server or leave the server when we're done. And this will be called from a button. So we need to make this public. And we'll call it leave game, public void leave game. So with leave game, it's a bit different based on whether you're hosting or if you're just another client. So we can say, well, if network server dot active, so remember to be using mirror, if network server dot active, and so we're running a server and we're running a client, so network client dot is connected, then we want to stop hosting. So stop hosting. Otherwise, we want to say stop client, because we can't be just a server on its own, because the server on its own can't press the button. So we're going to say here, network manager dot singleton dot stop host. And then down here we can say network manager dot singleton dot stop client. And this will automatically send us back to the home screen because we have set up in the network manager the online and offline scene. So as soon as we become offline, we actually go over there. So if we're just a client that leaves, we'll go back to the home screen, the server will keep running. Whereas if we're the host, we'll stop the host, so we'll go back to the home screen and all the other clients will be kicked. And that's it for the code, so now we just need to go make the UI. This UI will be a prefab. Well, it doesn't have to be, but I like making most things prefabs. So we'll go over here, we'll make an empty game object, we'll reset it, and we'll call it the game over display. Then we'll make that a prefab. And then we can just open that up in its own view. So if we double click the game over display, go into 2D mode, we can then get a good view of it. So the game over display has the game over display component on it, and then we'll have to drag these things in once we've got them. And then we want to make a canvas, so UI canvas. And with the canvas, we want to say screen space overlay, this is all fine. Whereas this needs to scale with our screen size, because it'll be a full screen thing. And we'll say our current resolution is 1920 by 1080 and match height. And we do want a graphic raycaster because we need to actually be able to click on this UI. And since we'll end up having building buttons and other things you can click on in the scene, we kind of want an empty game object here, or not an empty, but sorry, an invisible game object here to block all our clicks into the game scene. So what we can do is we can make a UI image. And images, as you see here, block raycasts if this checked. And we can hold Alt, click. And what that does is you can see all the settings here. This is now scaled to the screen size. So if your screen is wider, this will be wider too. This fills up the entire screen. And we can say here, set the alpha to 0. So it's completely transparent, but it means it can stop us now clicking on things behind the UI. It's like a shield. because we don't want to click on, our bases or our unit spawners to try spawning in more units. This should be a kind of first line of defense to stop us interacting with stuff when the game's over. We can also add some text, so let's click on the canvas, new UI, text Mesh Pro. And since we haven't actually used Text Mesh Pro yet in this project, we have to import the essentials. Now that that's done, we can go back, and this text should be a child of the canvas. There we go. So now for the text, I'll set it up how I had it in my own project. Let's do the anchors first. So I add 0.5, 0.5, 0.5, 1. And then for the positions, 0, 400, 0, 700, 0. And that leaves it like this. And then for the text, we can say, someone has won, ! To see kind of what it's going to look like. And I had it as bold with a font size of 70. This is kind of up to you to do it however you like. I'm just going to show you this is how I did it. And now it's time for your challenge. And I've already done some of it with you because I didn't want to leave you in the dark. But the challenge is to finish the game over display, or just have a go at making it look however you like it to. So we just need the parent game object, which we've already made, the game over display, which we've already put on, but it'd be great if you could actually drag in the components into it. We'll be doing that together, don't worry. Create some UI text to display the winner, just like we have, and create a button for leaving the game. We'll hook it up to the code in a minute if you don't know how to do that, but this should be enough just to get on with for now. So have a go, pause the video, and create your game over UI. Okay, I hope you paused and gave that a go. Let's head back. And as I said, I've already done most of it anyway. I just wanted you to be able to have a little bit of design time on your own. Now for the button, we'll make a new UI button text mesh pro. Put that as a child of the canvas, it already is. And for this button, we'll just set up the anchors like this, 0, 0.5, and then 0 is the second, and that's it. Then for the positions, 0, 20, 400, 460 is what I found to be good. I'll also get rid of this UI sprite, so I'll put it to none. And then we don't really want anything else on here right now. We just want to go to the text itself. And then for the text, I'll click on here. It's already stretched anyway. We just want to add some padding of, let's say, 5 around each side. And the actual button itself will say leave game on it. And then that can be bold. And the font size, I put it as auto size. And then over here, this is fine. I think this is good to go. Let's have a look in the game. So if I was to drag this into the scene, this is what it would look like. Obviously, it's kind of hard to see with the white text on the horizon here, but it's fine. That'll do for this. So let's head back into the actual prefab itself. So double click on the display, go back to the scene. And we need reference to the game over display parent, which I'll just do as the actual canvas game object. We'll be toggling that on and off. And the winner name text is this text over here. It'd be best if we were to rename it. So I can just say here, this is the background. This is the winner name text. This is the leave button. And then this is just the leave button text. That'll do. And we want to make the leave button, if we scroll down, on this button on click event, we want to add, drag in the game over display, and we have the game over display leave game function. So we want leave game to be called when we click on this button. So if we were to go to the canvas and disable that, because by default that should be off, we can then go back to the scene, and we want to jump over to the other scene, which is where it's going to happen. And we want to add in our game over display prefab. We can just stick it wherever you want, maybe here under the post-processing and everything. It doesn't matter too much. And yeah, there it is. It's in the scene. And when it starts existing, it listens for when the game is over. And when the game is over, it sets the text and it turns on the UI. So let's give that a go. But just before we build, let's go over to the network manager. And this is important. I almost forgot to do it, which is we need to add into this registered spawnable prefabs the game over handler, because this is an object that we spawn over the network, and anything we do spawn over the network has to be in this list. So let's quickly go over here, and we want to say prefabs game over handler. So let's go back, drag that in to this list. We'll go down. Unity is not wanting to cooperate. There we go. Game over handler overrides apply. Because if you don't do that, then what happens is whoever's the server, when they win or when they lose, whatever happens, when the game's over, the server will show up the UI, but the client won't because it fails to actually spawn the game over handler on both clients. And we should technically have done that in the previous video, but it didn't cause any issues because, we were just logging in the console and it doesn't really matter. And we were only doing that server side. But now that we're doing stuff on client side, we need the game over handler to be in this list. So now we can build and actually test that. Let's give it a go. Take this tank, we'll come over here and we'll try and destroy this base. And hopefully, when it dies, some UI should pop up for both players saying who won. So yeah, it says player 1 has won. And if I was to leave over here as a client, then I leave and this keeps going. And I'll test the other way around in a second to show you what would happen. So if I now host here and join as a client here, there is still a bit of a weird issue where if I start as a host on this external one, then they spawn at the bottom left and bottom right instead of diagonally. That will be sorted later when we make a lobby, but for now, it's not really too big of an issue. I can spawn my tank in, and I can go kill over here. That should say player 0. Yep, player 0 is won, and that's fine. And now if we leave over here on the host, then the client leaves too because there's no server anymore. So yeah, that's it for this lecture. We now have the game loop working. Of course, the game isn't that fun right now. We only have one type of unit and it's really big and slow. Maybe you want big and slow unit, but you probably also want some really cheap, fast to produce small units. So we'll be making the game a lot more fun now that we have the game loop working. So I'll see you in the next lecture. Goodbye. Hello everyone and welcome. In this lecture, we'll be making it so I can spawn in some units. Let's imagine I'm playing the game. My units are over here. And I'll switch over to this player, and let's say I manage to sneak around and kill the enemy base. Well, once I've won, the enemy unit should all be destroyed, and if there's other players in the game, their units shouldn't be destroyed. So we can now have events that say, when a particular player dies, destroy their units, and when we have buildings, destroy their buildings, stop their input. You'll see now I can't drag to make those boxes, I can't click to move my unit or anything, there's none of that, I can't do any of that stuff. So we're now handling what happens when the game is over. So let's get started. So now we have a way to win the game by destroying the enemy base, but we haven't considered having more than 2 players. If I die first and there's still 2 other people playing, I can still, control my units and stuff. We technically have a bit of UI blocking that when the game's over, but if the game isn't over yet, I can still continue doing things. And when we add the ability to purchase buildings, I'd be able to just keep purchasing more buildings, and it wouldn't be good. So we need to have some cleanup for when you die and some cleanup for when the game is over entirely. If we go over to our scripts, buildings, and the game over handler, then over here we have this client game over, which is an event to say to clients the game's over and display some UI. But the server needs to do things too when the game's over. So let's make a server version. So public static event action. And the server doesn't care about the name of the player. It's not displaying any UI or anything. So this one doesn't have any data with it. And we'll call it server on game over. And where do we call this? Let's have a look. So we call it on clients after RPCing to tell them the game's over. But on the server, we can just do it here. So server on game over, !.invoke. So that's really useful for knowing when the game's over. But we also need a way to know when a particular player dies. So if we go to the unit base script, we can easily find out in here when we die who it is that died. So let's make another event, and this is a server event. So public static event action. And this is actually going to pass through an integer, which will be the ID of the player that died. And then, for example, over in the health script, we can listen into this event, and we can say, when a player dies, and their ID matches the ID of the person with this unit or this building, then destroy this unit or this building. So anything that has health, whenever the base dies, all of its units, all of its buildings will die along with it. I think that makes sense. So we'll say server on player die. Now where does the player die in here? We'll go down. Okay, this is where their base dies. Currently we just destroy it. Let's also here raise this event, server on player die. But this has to take in the int, which is the player ID. So the way we can do that is, well, this base belongs to that player that died. So we can get the connection to client, and that has a property on it for connection ID. And that tells you here it's the unique identifier for that connection. We can then go ahead with that. We now have these events in place, so we should now go start actually subscribing to them and writing logic to happen when they're triggered. So if we go over to, let's say, the unit selection handler, when we die, we want this to stop happening. But this is completely client side, so we should listen into the client on game over event. So all we want to do in here is, whenever we start, we want to subscribe. So the game over handler dot client on game over. We want to make a method for client handle game over. And we can unsubscribe down here where we do the other event, unsubscribing. And now we need a method called client handle game over. So let's go down to the bottom. And for this event, or for this method, we can say private void client handle game over. And this has to take in a string because that's what we pass through with the event. We don't actually need to use it here because all we want to do when the game is over is just disable this script. So we can say enabled equals false. And now what that means is when the game's over, it'll stop running this update loop, which means it'll just stop checking all of this stuff. So we don't get the selection area or anything like that once the game is over. We want to do the same thing in the command giver. So if we go over here, let's scroll up, and we'll make a private void on destroy. And we want to say game over handler dot client on game over plus equals client handle game over. And we can do this again. Unsubscribe, take this method and stick it at the bottom. So private void client handle game over, passing in the winner name. And we can say down here, enabled equals false. So once the game is over, it stops doing raycasts and checking whether we should move or attack because the game's over. Now that's all client-side stuff. And that, at the end of the day, is just all visual things because let's say someone had an outdated version and they didn't have that code I'd just written. Well, they'd still be able to, select units and try and give them commands. So we need to make sure that all of the stuff that we definitely don't want players to do is also done on the server side. That's where the true authority is checked. And one of those things we should do on the server side is actually destroying the units when their base dies. So if we jump over into the health script, it's now time for your challenge, which is to destroy units and buildings. So anything with health should die when its base dies. And you're probably sick and tired now of subscribing and unsubscribing from events, but once you get used to it, it becomes a lot faster. And the main benefit is that it just makes it so much easier to add new functionality in later. So it does require more setup because we've had to define, event this spawned, event that spawned, event this died, event that died. But it then means that you come along later and decide, hey, I want to add in this new thing that happens when that dies. And it's such an easy thing to do. You just subscribe and write your logic. So you'll probably thank me later if you're sick and tired now of it, but what I'd like you to do is override the onStop server method, because we currently only override the onStart server method. Subscribe and unsubscribe from the server on player die event like that. So we know when some player dies, and then we also know who it is because it also passes through an int. So make a method server handle player die that takes in an integer. And we'll actually write the logic together. So just set this stuff up and pause the video, give it a go. I'll be back in a minute. Okay, hope you paused and gave it a go. Let's head back. We want to override on stop server, so like this. And we want to subscribe and unsubscribe to the event, like we said. So unit base dot on player die, so it's server on player die, plus equals server handle player die. We can then copy paste that down here and unsubscribe. And then the actual logic we'll just do right beneath it. So we'll make a server method called server handle player die. And then this method takes in an integer, like I said, connection ID. And it should all be happy now. Of course, if I don't type it wrong, let's make that capital, and now it is happy. And what we want to say here is, if the ID of the person who I've been told that's died, if that matches the person who owns this object, then destroy it because it means their base died. So we can say, well, if the connection to client inside this object, if that person's connection ID is not the same as the one being passed in, then it's not that player who died, so we just return. So if the player who died is not us, then return. If it is us, then we want to just kill this thing. So we can say deal damage, and we should deal the current health amount of damage. So everything that has a health script will die if its base died. The one other thing we have to think about now is the firing and movement, because like I said, if my units are already moving and firing and then the game's over, then they'll keep doing it and we want them to stop. So if we look over at the movement script, the way we do it is every frame we say get our target, and if it's not null then try and move to it. If it is null, then do all this. So what we really want to do is over in the targeter script, we want to say when the game's over, just clear the target, because we shouldn't have any targets once the game is over. So what we can do in here is we can do the usual start and stop. So let's do it here. We can say override on start server, override on stop server, and then we can subscribe to the methods, let's say here, the game over handler dot, and then we have that server method for the game being over. Subscribe server handle game over. Copy paste, unsubscribe, and then the actual method we can do, let's say down here. So we have server private void server handle game over. And what do we want to do in here when the game is over? We just want to clear our target. So let's just say, well, we can just call this method clear target. So that works for if we have a target, but what about in the movement script? Let's go to unit movement. If we have a path, like let's say I've just clicked to move somewhere and the game ends, you might be fine just letting the unit keep moving until it gets there, but I think we should just reset all the navmesh agent paths once the game's over. All the units can just stop wherever they are. So to do that, we simply need to, again, up here, say override on start server, override on stop server, and we might as well just do this to save us some time. So if I go back to the wherever it is, targeter script, let's just copy paste these two. So now we have to make a server handle game over method. So let's go down here, make a server method, private void server handle game over. And what do we want to do when the game's over in here? We just want to clear our navmesh agent path. So agent.reset path. So I think you'll be glad to hear now that I don't think we're making any or many more events now. We might be using events for sure, but we won't be making any more. We can now just go around into different scripts and say, this script should do this when the game is over, this script should do this when this player dies, this script should do this when this unit is spawned. We can just hook into events wherever we like now and start writing our own custom logic. So we can get into making the game fun now that the game works. We can spawn in, move around, kill the enemy base, we can win, we can lose. We now want to make it so that we can have different types of units, different types of buildings. We want to be able to place buildings. All that fun stuff is coming next. But let's give this a test before we get there. So let's go File, Build and Run, and see it in action. So let's see if it works. I'm going to go over here and I'm going to produce a few units and move them to the side for now. So if I move these over here, I'm going to go over here now and take a tank. So if I destroy the enemy base, it should do the usual, saying the game's over, but it should also kill these 3 units. Let's see if it works. Yep, those units are gone. And you'll also notice that when I try and click and drag now, the selection handle is gone. I don't get the little box. I can't actually select or move my unit anymore, no matter how much I click. And it's the same over here. I can't click on the base and do anything. The game is over. I can still hover over the health bars and see that, but that's no big deal. And now if I leave, and same over here. So yeah, that's it for this lecture. We now have a way to handle the game being over, as well as a particular player dying, so we can, kill their units, kill their buildings, do whatever, stop their input. And we will be using these events in more places as time goes on. We won't be necessarily making any more, but we'll be using the ones we've already made. And that allows us to then, let's say we make a building for resource generation when we add money. We then want that building, if it's still alive at the end because you've won, we want that to, let's say stop making more money. It isn't a necessary thing to do, but, it's still something you might want to do. So we can just hook into the event, say, if the game's over, then stop producing money. So now we can move on to placing of buildings. We can have it so that we get a bit of UI with some different building options to make resource generators and different types of unit spawners. And then we can also upgrade the unit spawners to have queues and just be a lot more fun to play with. That's it for now, and I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye.